I'm Peggy Farron. Welcome to the Understand Photography Show, where we talk about travel, nature, and fine art photography. We are going to talk about wild horse photography today with Scott Wilson. If you like our show, please leave a review on iTunes. That really helps us a lot. And also join our mailing list. If you go to understandphotography.com, the first thing you'll see, it says click here for freebies. Click there, put your email address, you'll be added to our email list, and then you have a choice of different things that you can download, like how to get tack sharp images every time, what kind of cameras should I buy, travel tips for photographers, things like that. We send out a newsletter once a month, so don't worry, we're not going to bombard you with 100 emails a day, which some people seem to do. We're not going to do that. The other way that you can keep in touch with us is to join one of our Facebook groups. We have two. So if you go to facebook.com/understandphotography, you will see down somewhere, I think on the left, it says groups. The first group is a general group. It's called the Understand Photography group. And you can post pictures, you can ask for critiques if you want. You can say, hey, need a new lens, which one should I buy? Or I'm thinking about going mirrorless. What do you guys think of this or that? Anything you want. General help is in that Facebook group. The second group is called Selling Your Photography as Art, and that is for those of us who want to sell our photography. Where should I post my photography online? How do I get into a gallery? I'm doing my first art show. Do you have any tips? That kind of stuff goes on. It's a support group, and of course you can share your work there too and ask for critiques. Critiquing is unique to what you're doing. So what sells, what customers might want to buy, may not be the same thing that wins competitions, and vice versa. So keep that in mind. So today, my guest is Scott Wilson. Scott is a landscape and wild photographer. He was the UK Landscape Photographer Finalist of the Year 4 times. As he said, always a bridesmaid, never a bride. But 4 times finalist is pretty impressive. He's from Scotland, but he moved to Denver, Colorado, and shortly after he moved, he was named Denver Instagrammer of the Year in 2017. His work is hung in galleries in Denver, and he's an amazing person. He has a great story. He's recovering from stage 4 colon cancer, and that's opened up new possibilities for him. We're going to talk about all that in this episode of the Understand Photography Show. So welcome, Scott.
Thanks, Peggy. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to the show.
So tell our audience about Scott Wilson. Now, first of all, where do you live?
I live in Denver, Colorado. I think, as you'll tell quite quickly, I'm not from around here, though. So I moved to Colorado in 2015 after spending my life and upbringing in Scotland, which is where I really fell in love with photography about 20 years ago.
Okay. Now you have a very unique story about just your life story is interesting, but leads into an interesting photography story. Why don't you tell us?
Sure. I mean, I think like many photographers, I started with a real passion for the outdoors and landscape, and I developed a landscape photography career, if you like, over the course of 15 years. Before I left the UK, I was Landscape Photographer of the Year finalist on 4 consecutive occasions. That really gave me a platform, if you like, to move to the US, to the Colorado outdoors, and I was just so excited to explore the landscape here and really sort of bed myself in as a landscape photographer in the United States. Very quickly, I joined a gallery in Denver, which was a landscape-focused gallery, and everything was going wonderfully. I was named Denver Instagrammer of the Year, and things were really rocking. And then I got the shocking news in summer 2016 that I'd been diagnosed with stage 4 colorectal cancer. And of course, you feel that life's just stopped. And of course, it hasn't stopped. But I've got to be honest, photography wasn't the first thing on my mind at that point, but it's very much my creative outlet. And I needed my photography, if you like, to get through this journey. And that's when my oncologist told me that the drug I was on, or one of the drugs I was on, had a very extreme photosensitivity, and I needed to avoid sunlight. So suddenly I saw my landscape career being pulled away from me. And then it was really Colorado parks to the rescue. I realized what an amazing abundance of wildlife we have in our doorstep, and I could basically access it from my car. And I started shooting over the course of my sort of 40-week chemotherapy process, shot wildlife from what I called the protective shade of my car. It was like my studio. So I would shoot wildlife, write some notes. I created a little book about my experience, and that was all basically developed within the sort of 4 doors of my SUV in Colorado.
Wow, that is just very inspiring. And that actually, I mean, it's a horrible thing that happened to you, but it kind of was good for your career, right? Didn't you get a lot of press about that?
In many ways, yes. I mean, I now describe myself as a landscape and wildlife photographer. This wasn't a temporary event, if you like. So after the end of the year, I had the amazing news that I was NED, which is no evidence of disease, after, you know, the most extreme stage that you can find. For those Scottish listeners that you might have, they might be more familiar with NED, meaning non-educated delinquent. So when I published that news on Facebook, it did raise a few eyebrows in my homeland, but it's definitely about being in remission. So I launched the book of my story, and that all raises funds for colorectal cancer research, in effect. So we've raised about 40,000 to date with that book. But really what I found is, and I think your audience will appreciate this, you know, there's probably a lot of people at my kind of age group that are maybe starting to think about these kind of health concerns generally. And people say, I love the book, great picture of a hummingbird, but how did you know that, you know, you had cancer? What first gave you those clues? And that's when I realized it wasn't really a fundraising book. It was a book that opened up a conversation about cancer through the beauty of photography. And that's really how I sell it now.
Oh, wow, that is inspiring. That's awesome. And how did you have the energy to write a book when you were going through all that?
Well, interesting. I think I respond. I mean, I was in my sort of late 40s at the time. I think having age on your side with a cancer diagnosis does help. You know, if you've got the mindset, you've got the fitness to cope with chemotherapy. Chemotherapy is a world away from what my mother went through 25 years ago, for example, in terms of being able to manage nausea, energy, etc. But interestingly, every 2 weeks I would have this dose of chemotherapy, but they always put steroids in it to just keep the energy up. And I just had this absolute burst of energy after a chemotherapy treatment, where I would just sit and write notes all night. I was completely wired. It was like being on drugs. So despite beliefs that chemotherapy will knock you out, it can sometimes actually perk you up because of the support drugs that are in there as well.
I had no idea. Wow.
I'm not recommending it, but
No, but you're an ambitious guy anyway, or you wouldn't be who you are.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's true.
Now, but today we're not even going to talk about this, but it's just so interesting. Although I do want to talk a little bit about it, because to me, just the shooting through the car sounds interesting. So we're going to talk about horses.
Yeah, of course.
Photographing horses, and maybe you can tie it together. But how do you shoot wildlife through the car? I mean, how do you get them to come to your car or be anywhere near your car?
I think one of the things I found quite quickly, what I thought of as a handicap shooting from the car, in many ways, and many wildlife photographers will connect with this, it can be an asset. And animals will instantly fear a human who's walking about, but they're much less circumspect about a car that's stationary and not threatening, if that makes sense. So in that sense, you've created a blind, I think, which is helpful. As long as you've then got the kit to like stabilize your equipment, so you've got have a big bean bag that fits over the door, etc. Some have much more sophisticated solutions with kind of screws and bolts, etc. I've just got a very sort of rudimentary bean bag, but having that stability, turning your engine off, being the ability to sit in comfort and wait for things to happen, these actually became assets, as well as a health benefit for me, completely avoiding the sunshine. There are a couple of things that I learned though. If you're sitting with a Nikon DSLR and a 28-inch lens, and you try and vault a gear stick to get to the other side of the car as a badger runs past it, that can be quite painful. So after a while, I sort of adjusted and realized that sitting in the back of the car might be a better solution. And the little things as well, that a standard chemotherapy side effect is a condition called neuropathy. that creates this numbness and a feeling of pins and needles in your hands and feet. And I would be holding the camera and thinking I was catching a decisive moment, and I'd missed it completely because I couldn't feel the shutter release. So I just put a little paint spot on the shutter release, like a sort of braille dot, and suddenly found that I was able to feel that much more easier. So I think by being sort of disabled, if you like, by the chemotherapy, I was able to find solutions that actually might work better for completely able-bodied people as well.
So how did you put something on the shutter?
I just put a paint spot on the shutter release button so that I could actually, so it felt like a raised dot, like a braille dot, and I could actually feel it rather than, so if you clearly, because of, I just suppose, ergonomics, that they've tried to make it as smooth and as beautiful as possible, but I actually needed some roughness and some abrasion to know exactly where that was because the sensitivity had gone from my fingers.
Oh, that's fascinating. So let's kind of move on to horses, even though that's such an interesting subject. But so what now, are there wild horses in where you live?
Yeah, there's an area of northwest Colorado. It's about 300 miles from where I live in Denver. It's called San Wash Basin. It's a Bureau of Land Management area. It's massive. It's about 160,000 acres. And within that space, there are about 400 to 600 purely wild horses running free, which is kind of the ambition, is to sort of retain that freedom and wildness.
Wow.
It's an absolutely stunning environment. I mean, I've been lucky enough to be on safari in Zambia and seen some absolutely beautiful wild creatures. But honestly, I've had as much energy and stimulus from watching these wild horses in action as I have on that amazing experience in Africa. And it's just so close to home as well.
I know. We're so lucky to live in the United States. I've never been to Colorado. One more place I need to see. Oh my gosh.
Put it on the list.
Pardon me?
Put it on the list. Whether it's landscape, wildlife, wild horses, there's definitely something for everyone to shoot in Colorado.
That's awesome. So what makes wild horses a good subject for photography? What's so great about the wild horses?
It's hard to capture in one thing. They're dynamic. You can see that picture behind me. There's just this wild, raw energy that you wouldn't necessarily get from a domestic horse. So just the fact that these are semi-accessible wild animals is a thrill in itself. I think they're large, so actually being able to capture a large animal is far easier than, say, capturing a hummingbird. So having that access to large wild animals, I think, is also great. And then just the diversity. I mean, it's not like one type of wild horse. The diversity of colors and patterns and ages and sizes of these wild horses is absolutely thrilling. So you're never going to come back with an identical experience, no matter how many times you go. And it all changes through the seasons as well. So if you think springtime is a real kind of foaling and fighting season, I mean, the mares will give birth to a foal. Within 11 days, they're ready to mate again. And that readiness creates the aggression in the males. And they're literally fighting, not to the death, but these are serious wild fights where they're biting each other's necks, and there's blood and there's skin flying. So these are truly high energy, testosterone filled events to watch. Summer's a little bit quieter. It's very high heat, low water, lots of bugs around. So it's probably not such a thrill there. But when the rabbit brush, for example, starts to bloom in the fall, that's just another experience altogether. And that feels more almost like a landscape experience where you've got this beautiful backdrop of the mountains, the sagebrush and the rabbit brush with the horses roaming. And then winter is another experience again. I mean, getting a horse with frost in its whiskers and just dripping sort of close-ups is an absolute wonderful experience. So no matter what season you go, you'll get something different.
Wow. Wow, that is cool. But it sounds to me like the most exciting time would be spring.
I think so. I mean, I am drawn to the fight scenes particularly, but many people aren't. I mean, I've actually built a strong followership on Facebook because of the horses. I mean, it almost doubled my followers because of the interest from people in horses. The passion around the wild horses is absolutely fantastic. But there are many of my followers that don't want to see fight scenes. You know, they'll actually say, listen, I love your work, but the fight scenes are too much for me. I can't look. So it's not for everybody, and I accept that.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. So now what was the name of the place where you go?
It's called Sandwash Basin. It's about 25 miles from a little town called Maybell, which is just outside Craig, which is probably the biggest near town in Colorado. So sort of northwest corner, just south of Wyoming.
Oh, so how do you know where to go? I mean, you said it's how many acres, and there are only 500 horses?
Yeah, so I said it's 160,000 acres, so it's absolutely vast. There are dirt roads that you can sort of follow, and I'm not saying the horses navigate towards the dirt roads by any means, but you can kind of spot them from the road. You're just looking for, sometimes it can just be ears that just pop up behind a little hill and park up, you know, walk up and try and get close enough to shoot. The guidelines there are not to get closer than about 100 feet. So as long as you respect that, they'll tend not to get too startled, and you can have, you know, a great kind of action scene sort of unfolding in front of you. Finding the basin itself is relatively easy. I mean, it's well mapped, but I do add a very serious note of caution for anyone that just goes in there without considering the road conditions and the kind of car you need. There is no, these are not surfaced roads by any means. It's called Sandwash Basin for a reason. And if there's even 10 minutes of rain, it will turn to slick. And I remember my first visit there panicking as I watched a Ford F-150 that was super rated for 4x4 performance go downhill in front of me sideways because it couldn't cope with the slick. So you really have to be very cautious about when you go. There are many people that you know get flats. They need to get recovery, and it's not a place that you want to get stuck in. So I just, as excited as I am to share the horse experience, it has to go with this big dose of be careful around the driving experience.
Wow. I mean, is there any, like, do you feel like you have the experience now that nothing will happen to you, or is it just like a luck of the draw?
My last two trips, I've had flat tires. Now, I mean, I can change a tire, not a problem, but I have two cars. The Jeep had a spare, the Volvo didn't. So I was actually stranded 12 hours overnight, and it was 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, luck, yeah, so I had overnight gear in the car and was fine, and actually just ended up having a great time shooting the Milky Way. But I guess it's stressing how remote this is. The recovery guy couldn't get to me for 12 hours. So you need to be prepared to sit through that. So I don't usually take that car that doesn't have the spare installed in it, but you just have to be cautious.
Wow. Okay, that is good advice. Now, do you need permission to get out there, or can you just go?
No, there's no permission required. It's open access. You can even camp there. Many people that I know sleep in their cars, particularly in warmer weather. So there's no permission. And I think, just to repeat the caution, just making sure that someone knows you're there. You can lose phone access very easily as well. So if you don't show up when you're supposed to show up, you kind of want people to be watching out for you.
It's funny. I just recorded a show on the Everglades with Joe, and pretty much the same thing. We said, don't ever go alone. Make sure somebody knows where you are.
I think that's the reminder that this is a wild experience. And, you know, many people go in with this lovely affection for the horses, and they might have the experience of driving in. You've seen a few horses drive out again. But if the weather changes, the horse is a little bit deeper, it can easily become a far more difficult experience. So it's just remembering you are in the wild with wild animals.
Wow. All right. So what other research should we do before we head out there? Make sure you have enough warm clothes to get stuck overnight. Make sure somebody knows where you are.
I think weather's clearly an important one. If it's going to rain, I wouldn't even venture there at all. If it's been snowing, it can actually create a good surface for driving as long as the temperature stays below freezing rather. So just having that kind of knowledge of actually what are the conditions like. If that snow melts while you're there, then suddenly you're in the same slick situation that you would be with the rain and the mud. I think just knowing as well, there's no amenities there at all. So there are no bathrooms, there's no water. You are deep in the wild, so make sure that you have supplies in your car. Ideally, you've got a spare tire if you need it. You've got enough fuel to basically drive maybe 200 miles without refilling again, and knowing that the nearest petrol station is 35 miles from there. So just having that mind that I need to have plenty of gear, plenty of fuel, plenty of time. I think that they're probably the key warnings.
Is there any cell phone service out there?
It's intermittent, so it depends who you're with. So I'm with AT&T. That seems to have a fairly decent service, but other services don't work so well there. So again, having a GPS, for example, that would work without a cell service would be helpful as well. A piece of advice there is sometimes to download an offline version of maps, so you can actually work your way around places without needing cell service.
Yeah. So what should we know about horses before we go out to photograph wild horses? Like for me, if I'm going to go out and photograph wild horses, I'm going to go to Paynes Prairie here in Florida, which is probably a lot safer.
I don't want to overblow danger here. This isn't. I've never felt at risk or in danger. It's really the driving conditions are something you have to be cautious about.
Yeah, for us, it's just the alligators and snakes.
Okay, well, there are snakes actually. There are rattlesnakes.
Yeah. So what do we need to know about the horses' behavior? Like I know a lot about bird behavior, right? I live in Florida. Everybody photographs birds down here. I don't know that much about horse behavior, like the makeup of different herds. And as you were saying about, in the spring with the testosterone and all that kind of stuff.
So they live in bands. They live in bands. A band is usually run by a lead stallion. He will ordinarily have a lead mare with him. So she's kind of in charge of leading the horses to water or leading them to sort of better grazing areas. He's the defender of the group. He's also the mater within the group, and he will basically dominate that group. You could have a band that's anything from 3 horses up to 30 horses. I've seen sort of many bands in sort of 20s, and then you've got one dominant male, many females. They'll have young with them. They won't tolerate a competitor stallion for too long. So they'll usually get driven out, and so then you'll have separate bands that are called stallion bands, which are basically just young males that don't have partners. And they're actually good bands from a photography point of view to follow, because they're much more aggressive, and it could be playfully aggressive or it could be genuinely aggressive. But in terms of dynamic shots, you're probably going to get a lot more interaction with them. If you're actually after a sort of more pleasant scene, if you like, than actually staying with a band that has many foals and mares, you just see some lovely interaction between a mother and a foal, for example, which creates a beautiful shot, which is completely different from a fight scene. So the diversity is there, and actually consciously moving between different types of bands, I think, will help you find that as well.
And so are you just like driving and searching for these horses, or are there certain areas that they are just going to be?
They tend to gravitate to certain areas at different types of year. So, and so much of it is driven by water availability. So when there is plenty of water, they might actually be more difficult to find because they'll be spread around. And that's the same as going on safari in Africa, for example. When water's scarce, they will congregate around that scarce water. So actually just staying near to a scarce water source is a great way of knowing that, they will come to you. In those times of plenty, though, you are kind of searching, and you could drive for an hour and not see anything, but then you might come upon a band or 3 bands with maybe between 30 and 60 horses all kind of gathered in a particular area. So you've got to be on the lookout. Again, because of the kind of undulations of the ground, they can be very difficult to spot. So you have to be very, very alert. I'll always have binoculars so I can kind of see at a distance. You often fool yourself. What you thought was a horse actually turns out to be a bush. So there's that constant need to just pay attention, if you like. And then the more times you go, you start to get familiar. You'll start to aim for particular spots where you think you might have some luck. And if that doesn't work out, you know where to go next. So I think developing a familiarization with the landscape helps, because you kind of know where to go straight away rather than sort of stumbling upon places.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds hard to find, but okay, so let's say you're driving, you find, you see a herd and
You've got to call it a band.
a band, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's
They're
okay.
not called herds?
No, band of horses.
What are herds? Are those cows?
Cows, I guess.
Anyway, so you get out of the car and you put a tripod up, or
I did start with the tripod. Actually, yeah. So it's hard work though. I mean, sometimes you might walk 3/4 of a mile, and then you're with your tripod. You've got a 400 or 600 mil lens. That's kind of heavy work. I mean, I'm still in treatment as well, so I wouldn't say I'm 100% fit. So I've actually just found, simple as it is, that the monopod's a lot easier to transport the gear. Being in Colorado, there's a lot of light, so actually I'm not suffering too much on the speed front by having a monopod instead of a tripod. So monopod, you usually get away with it. I have heavy equipment. I see many people with maybe a 1 to 600 lens that's completely hand portable, and they'll carry those as well. So a tripod is not essential by any means.
Oh, okay. Okay. We just did a review it's on YouTube, on the Wimberley mono gimbal head. That thing is pretty cool. Have you seen that?
I'm not sure that I have. I have a Wimberley gimbal head, but I doubt it's the same one. Mine's about 10 years old now.
It's really small.
Right.
And lightweight.
Okay.
But it'll hold your big lens.
It's definitely not mine. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway. Okay. So you get out, and you don't want to be more than, what'd you say, 100?
Yeah, that's the guideline, 100 feet. And that's not just about the horses. I actually think it makes for better photography. If you are in very close vicinity of these horses, you're changing their behavior. They're suddenly tense, they're aware of you, they're looking at you. If you start to edge closer, they will move back. Believe me, no matter how fast you think you can move, they can move faster than you just walking slowly. So it's not in your interest at all to pressure them. So I find with a 400, 600 mil lens, you've got that distance, you can stay safe, and you'll just get them performing normally. As I say, if a good signal really is if their heads are down and they're grazing, and you know you can move closer, but don't get to the point that every time you move, they're moving further away, because that's when you know you are too close.
Okay. Okay. How far is 100 feet? Like, how can I gauge that? Because I can't imagine that.
Well, I use metric, so 30 meters, 33 meters. So.
Oh, so it's even, yeah, okay. Well, then never mind. So what if we do, they notice us? Are they curious? Are they going to come over? And what if they do come over?
You move back. I mean, the advice is to move back. So try and maintain that distance. And it's not a precise science. Of course, sometimes you might end up a little bit closer, etc. But you don't really want to be in a situation where a wild horse is coming up nuzzling you. That's just not what it's about. So I would respect the distance and keep moving back, frankly.
Should we be afraid of them?
I've never had what I would describe as a scary encounter. But again, I think behaving correctly will help. You do not want to get in the vicinity of a fight. These fights are rapid, they're very, very intense, and they're very violent. And a horse they'll instinctively try and avoid you. But in the middle of these fights, they probably can't see you. And if you get in the way, you're not going to survive. So maintain that respectful distance. I would also not get between a horse that has moved away from its band and will want a route back. So actually blocking that so you can get a better shot isn't going to help. And you might not create a violent situation, but you're certainly going to create an uneasy situation for the horse. So avoiding that. And like many wildlife situations, don't get between a band and a foal. I think that's when you will start to see a little bit more protective behavior. So be very respectful that these are wild animals in a wild situation. And babies are babies. And people want to protect their babies.
Yeah, everybody, we all do. That's why I said the alligators here, they won't bother you. 99% of the time, they're just going to ignore you, except for if it's a mother with babies. They don't ignore you. So, okay, so you're using 400 or 600 millimeter lens, you said?
Yeah, and again, I find that depending on the time of year, so when there is water scarcity, you can get a little bit closer because they're thirsty, and so they're not going to be moving away. So you probably get 400 mil distance is okay. I also keep a 7 to 200 mil handy for what you might call wild horse in landscape situations. And there's some beautiful scenes where you want the horse as the subject, of course, but you want it to be draped in this wonderful environment. And Sandwash is a lovely landscape environment alongside being a great wildlife location. So I keep that handy in the car, but it wouldn't be my go-to. And then different types here, the 600 will do the same job as the 400, simply because you can't get within a sort of decent distance without them moving away. 400 is obviously great. It's an f2.8, so if there's an early morning or sort of dusk situation, it's got the extra light capacity, which is very helpful as well.
So it'll focus. So what kind of camera settings are you using mostly?
I tend to start, I get a little bit paranoid about speed, so I'm always trying to keep above 1/2000th of a second, especially when I'm on the monopod. I will start between f6.3 and f8 and sort of get what I call the safe shots in the bag, and then I'll widen the aperture and go for something that might be a little bit more artful and blur the background, etc. But I tend to try and just secure the shots at the kind of f7 type end, and then I'll work down to f4, sometimes even f2.8 if I want to go for something more artful.
Now, do you put your ISO on automatic, or?
No,
You're just, are you a full manual?
Constantly changing. I need 3 hands, so it's all full manual. And I'm not saying that's necessarily the best way to go. It's just what I do, but nothing's automatic apart from the focus.
I'm the same way, and I don't know why. I guess if you start that way, it's harder to go back to anything automatic. And
I had a debate when I was on safari this year. The guide was very pro kind of auto settings, etc., and just aperture priority, automatic ISO, etc. And I was at the other end of the extreme, and we both got great shots. So there's not necessarily a right answer, but I guess I'm constantly shuffling settings, whereas he wasn't. He was just shooting. So there's pros and cons.
But you just get so used to it, it becomes second nature, you know?
Absolutely. Your thumb just knows what to do.
Yeah. What about filters? Do you use like a polarizer?
Not with the wildlife situations. I used a lot of filters in my landscape work. So 0.75 graduated filters almost constantly in the front of my landscape lens, but I haven't used filters in the wildlife situation.
Okay.
Again, they compromise speed. So that's, I mean, to me, speed is almost everything in wildlife, and a filter just takes that away from you.
Great point. So what about, have you photographed domestic horses too?
Not so much. I was very privileged before I moved from the UK. I was invited to shoot some racehorses in training in England, and it was a fascinating experience, real privileged stuff. Very different from shooting wild horses, and I would argue very different from shooting normal domestic horses. So if you could take those three, I mean, I think shooting domestic horses is more like portraiture. And I've seen plenty of Facebook pages dedicated to equine photography, and there's some of it looks like fantasy work in terms of the beautiful grooming and the massive manes and big tails, etc. But it's as far away as you could possibly get from this wild horse here. So that's not kind of my sphere, if you like. The race horses, though, the tension and the running, it felt much more like sports photography. It was really dynamic experience, and probably closer to the wildlife experience. The difference was, because they were training, they're in a circuit. So I could experiment. I could try, well, that didn't really work. I'll try that again. Do you know what? I'm going to go for a real slow panning shot this time. And I went home and I had an array of things that I could choose from. The wildlife is much more like live sports action, where if you miss it, it's gone. You're not going to get another chance at it. So that's back to that playing safe. And once you've got some safe things in the bag, then I'll maybe start to experiment. But very different approaches to all three, I think.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's I mean, horses are such beautiful animals, and
Mm.
the wild horses, especially your work, you show all their muscles, and oh,
Mm.
they just look so amazing. But you're right, I'm on all those Facebook. I get all those Facebook posts too of those gorgeous horses that like fantasy. You're right, they
Yeah,
look so amazing.
it's like dream stuff, isn't it? So, and there's people
Yeah,
making their careers with that, and good luck to them. It's just a different style from what I do.
yeah, that is so cool. So, what are some of the biggest challenges? All right, speed is one of them. You said you're trying to keep it as fast as you can, your shutter speed as fast as you can keep it, and you usually try to keep it at a minimum of 2,000 if possible.
Yeah, and that's me. That's me being pessimistic there. If I can get it at 4,000, I'm much happier. So,
Oh,
um,
okay.
but but again, the light in Colorado is so bright that I have become accustomed to shutter speed normality at sort of 4,000 that I would have only dreamt about in the UK.
Yeah, 'cause the sun doesn't even shine there, does it?
Not a lot of light support at all.
So, are you shooting these horses? Are you photographing them all day long?
Um, Again, you learn when the good times are, and a little bit like a lot of wildlife photography. Middle of the day when it's pure bright, there's haze around, the horse is a little bit less active because of the heat. Between 11 o'clock and 4 o'clock, if it's a summer day, you're probably going to get a lot less action. I think just the excitement of being there, you're so remote. I probably do just keep driving around aimlessly, but I'm not expecting a lot in that time. The real kind of great moments are just after sunrise. The light on horses as the sun comes up can be absolutely glorious as you get that sort of backlit rim lighting, etc. It's just truly beautiful. And then as they kind of warm up, they're getting a little bit more energized. So that's when the kind of action might start to kick in. But I'd say by 10:30, 11 o'clock, that's waning. And then late afternoon, they're thirsty and they're basically coming to water. So you get a lot of activity around a watering hole. For example, they'll get in the water, they're splashing about, there's sort of play fighting, etc. These are just wonderful dynamics to take advantage of. And of course, that's just before sunset. And that's a whole other kind of photographic delight in itself, is sort of seeing horses silhouetted against a setting sun or kind of roaming home across a sort of mountainside. So it's just great any time of day. But you're right, middle of the day is probably the least productive.
So, do you go out there and you camp for a few days? Because you said it's 300 miles from your house.
Yeah, so various times of year I'll do different things. So if it's summer, I'll happily sleep in the car. You know, it's warm, etc. I'm actually going up tomorrow, and I've booked just a local hotel for a couple of nights because the temperature can get very severe. You are very exposed and remote. And if there's a hotel nearby, why not take advantage of it? But you know, plenty of other people would say that they would prefer to camp out there. You often come across little areas where someone's had a campfire, etc. So it's absolutely fine to do that as long as you take the normal camping precautions.
Wow. Of course, it's funny. I have a friend who I hike in the Everglades with. He's a real rugged Everglades kind of guy, and he has been trying to talk me into camping ever since I met him. And I've been camping twice.
It is great fun, and I think, as I said, if you have a landscape and a wildlife mindset, the opportunities to suddenly be in this remote area in the middle of the night with a starry sky backdrop is just a wonderful landscape delight. So it just means you don't sleep at all. You shoot all night and then shoot all day.
That's it. Well, you can sleep between 11 and 4.
Absolutely. I need to train myself. Yeah.
What else? What are some tips? So summarize tips for us on shooting wild horses, photographing wild horses.
Tips. I think certainly be alert, be respectful to the wild horses. They are wild animals after all. Have the right kit with you. So as I said, I think if you only had one lens, a 400 lens would probably do it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't go with a 7200. You just won't get as close. 600 is great, but it's not. Sometimes that might be too close. I think 400 is probably the optimum. Be aware that you're in a landscape environment as well, so don't always go for close-up shots that are so tight. Actually getting a horse with a wonderful backdrop can be a very evocative way of producing a wonderful piece of art. Be very aware of the environment you're in as far as driving and surviving goes. So, you know, it's not just a day out at the park. This is a sort of true wildlife experience. Respect the horses, respect their environment, don't interfere, certainly don't bring apples or anything like that and try and coax a horse. You know, just keep your distance and respect their wildness, and just enjoy it. I mean, I've only discovered wild horse photography in the last 2 years, and it's now a very, very big and thrilling part of my kind of photographic portfolio. They're just a joy to shoot, and as I say, you will always come back with something different. So despite all the caveats, it's just something to enjoy and take advantage of.
Now, do you give photo tours like this?
Never have, no.
No, okay. Because boy,
Yeah,
I want to go with you.
Who knows? Maybe when I retire. But I have to remind people that photography it's my hobby. I mean, it's my creative outlet. So I have a day job to perform. So this is my outlet. And if I was doing workshops, that would feel like work. So I need to be able to release the pressure as well and enjoy it like others.
Yeah, it is work. You know, I started doing workshops, I guess, 10 years ago, and I do more traveling by myself than I do the workshops. And people are like, why don't you just make a workshop? Then you could travel for free. And it's like, it doesn't feel like free, and it doesn't feel like travel. It feels like work. Yeah. It's fun work, but it's work.
Yeah, and I mean, I have many very accomplished professional photographer friends, and actually joined a friend last year to see the Northern Lights in Alaska. Mm-hmm. And it was exactly as you say. He just took me along as a guest, so I wasn't there to learn or be part of a workshop. But just watching his focus was all on making sure that his students were in the right place, doing the right thing, learning what they needed to learn. So his joy as a photographer was in his time off. It's not in that workshop, and certainly he wasn't coming back with a portfolio of shots that he would have chosen to shoot by himself. So I totally get the difference between being a photographer on a workshop, and I don't think that's an easy passage to get to do what you want, because you're not doing what you want. You're teaching.
Yeah, you did make me think of a couple more questions about the horses. Is it illegal to feed them?
I suspect it is. You know, I don't actually know the answer to that, but if a guideline would be none of the authorities feed them. So these horses are basically out there on their own. If there's a drought situation or there's a no food situation, they are treated as wild animals, and there's nothing is going to recover from that position in an official capacity. So if the authorities won't feed them, there's no way the public should be feeding them. So whether it's illegal or not, you shouldn't be interfering. But it's a good question. I'd actually like to know the answer to. But
yeah, I bet it is.
Yeah, I would suspect it is.
I know it's illegal to feed anything wild here, but there are signs all over the place to not feed alligators, because if you feed the alligators, then they associate humans with food, and then they can get aggressive.
That doesn't sound like a good equation.
No. That's why when I hike remotely, I'm not afraid, because those alligators have never even seen people. Yeah. But if you're like along the side of the road, then you kind of have to be more wary of the alligators that are hanging out there, because you don't know if somebody fed them or not. Yeah, no, that's a good point. So what about another question? There's just things pop in my head after. Okay, so you're doing two different types of shoots. You're doing a wildlife shoot, and you're doing a landscape with wildlife shoot. Mm-hmm. What kind of composition tips can you give us?
So I think, so I mean, the words in my head are tight and loose. So effectively, if you're shooting wildlife, you want to be relatively tight. I think you don't want to be so tight that you don't have space to process back in Lightroom or Photoshop, whatever you use. But wildlife photography tends to be a tighter focus. So if you look at that picture behind me, there's actually very little cropping in that image, and I had to keep moving back actually to ensure that the horse wasn't cropped out of the image. But that's probably the right amount of space for a wildlife image of a horse. That's very,
okay. And let me just stop you because I have to explain what you just said to the We have a much larger podcast audience than viewers. So basically, it's a horse. There's room in front, like a compositional rule. So there's room where the horse is going to move into. But the horse is running and its head is down. But there is very little, there's sky above his head, but not a lot.
Yeah.
And there's land underneath his feet, but not a lot. So it's pretty tight, except for there's room in front of the way it's moving.
Yes,
okay.
And thank you for explaining that. I apologize to listeners that I was doing a lot of sort of visual cues there. I think with the landscape as well, I tend to come at that with a landscape photographer's eye, where I'm looking for a wonderful, kind of usually more expansive composition. And I guess if I'm honest, I think about the horse in the same way as I might think about a tree. You know, just how am I going to position this horse within that environment to give me the composition that I want? Invariably, it will be on the third, but actually I find myself increasingly trying to change that dynamic and go like a very kind of having a horse looking straight on in a very straight pose in the bang in the middle of a composition is actually something I increasingly find quite motivating. So the horse's own position, whether it's looking straight on or it's standing at the side, will actually affect how you bring that composition to life. But just being very aware of the sky, the hill or the mountain behind you, if you've got water, how do they all interplay and just create a set of shapes that's very, very pleasing?
Okay. Well, I'm excited. And you send us some pictures so we can put them in our show notes, right?
Absolutely. I might follow up with a couple of more horse landscape type images. I'm not sure I gave Heather those. So.
Okay, because your photos are amazing. You are such a good photographer. Now, how did you just pick up a camera and start learning, or?
Literally, yes. So 20 years ago, or 23 years ago now in Glasgow, my wife had just moved over from Spain. We were living in the city and actually decided we want to be a little bit more rural. So we moved just outside of Glasgow, and I remember washing the dishes one night, looking out the window and seeing these four eyes looking back at me, and it was a couple of deer. And of course that means nothing to anyone in Colorado. They're saying we see these all the time, but to me this was a thrilling experience. I was like, darling, where's my camera? And she's, don't be stupid, you don't have a camera. And that's when I realized that I did actually want to be a photographer, and I had a lot to learn. But I would really credit the club scene for actually a lot of my kind of growth. And I think if you can join a club and actually listen to judges with a kind of growth mindset, not take it as criticism, but a real opportunity to learn, then that probably accelerated my photographic learning. Probably took 10 years down to 2, if you like, and before you knew it, I was getting published and in sort of national exhibitions and things. So just take advantage of the generosity, if you like, of clubs and fellow photographers. It's a very willing hobby, I think, in terms of people's desire to share and get other people up to the same standard.
Boy, do I agree with that. In fact, the other show we recorded, this is my third show recording today, and the other one was about mentoring and finding a mentor, but we also talked about photo buddies and clubs and things like that. So, and it can be a social activity. It can be a solitary activity.
Yeah,
it can be both.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going away for 3 days as it happens to shoot the wild horses. I will be completely by myself. But I've also got another 2 dear friends, and we often go as a 3. And I think as long as you give each other space, as long as you're going to come back with something a little bit different. If you all come back with identical shots, there's going to be tension. But if you can actually come back with different scenes and respect each other's boundaries in that, then it can be a great social experience. I absolutely agree with you.
Awesome. So what adventures are coming up for you next?
So a number of things. So as I say, I'm going away for 3 days tomorrow to shoot the wild horses. Winter in Colorado is a wonderful experience. I don't feel the need to travel outside of state, but there's plenty of places I haven't been. Telluride rather is a very photogenic town, which I haven't visited, so we'll take a family trip down there. The Grand Monument in Western Colorado is something else that I haven't seen, so I'm going to try and pick up those as landscape opportunities. On the cancer front, I've got a lot of advocacy going on. We're trying to get a bill through the state capitals that actually take up a lot of my time in the first quarter of the year. But then I've got a couple of trips coming up. We're going to northern Spain as a family to my wife's homeland And when we arrive, I mean, I've got a wonderful group of photographers there, and it's just like a ready-made group of friends, and trips just happen. So the coast of northern Spain, the kind of very eerie atmospheric forests that are in the inland, these are all great experiences, very different to where I live now. So having those up and coming next year is already very exciting.
Now, do you know of this photographer named Marina Cana, C-A-N-A?
Yeah, I do. Wonderful wildlife photographer.
She's somewhere in northern Spain.
She is Cantabria, which is the next region along from the Basque Country, but I know exactly where she shoots. So,
Oh
yeah,
my God, her
she's got
stuff is
some
amazing.
really beautiful work. Yeah.
I got to get her on my show sometime because I've been following her for quite some time because I'm like, wow.
How's your Spanish?
Well, the second time I moved to Florida was in 1993, and I took adult ed classes for 1 year, and then I quit, and I just started picking it back up.
Okay. You could do your first Spanish podcast then with Maria.
Yeah. Does she speak English? Do you know?
I don't know. So I only know her through social media. I don't claim any better.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. But wherever she shoots, is like a safari area right in Spain.
There's a wonderful natural reserve. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it's a beautiful reserve in Cantabria. They've got lots of animals that look like they're living wild, and it's got this sort of beautiful green backdrop of the sort of Cantabrian landscape. So she gets some stunning imagery in a beautiful setting. But I think many of it's a captive setting, but she's not disguising that.
Okay, that's cool. Well, you sound like you've got some exciting things coming up. Good for you. Now, where can our audience find you?
Well, thanks for asking. So my wife being from northern Spain, she has an unusual name, which is Axpe, A-X-P-E. So everything that I do photographically is my name and her name combined. So that's Wilson Axpe. The reason I did that is Scott Wilson is a very common name. If you plug my name into Google, I'll probably come up on about page 43. But if you can remember Wilson Axpe and plug it in, then I will come up immediately. So whether it's Instagram, Facebook, or my website is wilsonaxpe.com, then I should be relatively easy to find.
And how do you spell Axpe? So it's W-I-L-S-O-N?
A-X-P-E.
A-X-P-E.
Yeah. And for those in the military, that would be Alpha X-ray Papa Echo.
So you're on Instagram, Facebook, and your website is the same?
It's www.wilsonaxpe.com.
Okay.
So I'm also on 500px, but I've been using that a little bit less these days. So.
Oh, okay. So we will have your links, of course, in the show notes. And since you're going to photograph the horses in the snow right now, but this show is not airing for 6 weeks, maybe we'll get some of those pictures too.
Yeah, sure. I've got some from last year showing snow and whiskers, etc. And I think I gave a couple of those to Heather.
Oh, okay.
I'm hoping for snow. I'm not actually sure there's snow there just now. It's certainly very cold, but I'm not sure there's snow in the basin. So fingers crossed that I get enough snow, but not so much that it becomes prohibitive.
You know, one of my goals in life is to never, ever go anywhere too cold.
Okay. Well, last year, on January the 2nd in San Wash Basin, it was minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. So
you weren't out in that, were you?
Yeah, I was. And I took my sister. My sister was visiting from Scotland. She was turning 50. She had a pony as a child. She's always loved horses. So this was a treat to take my sister to see the horses. And one of my memories was Lindsay sitting in the car, just hands absolutely frozen from this extreme temperature outside. So even though it was glorious sunshine, it looked like a beautiful day, it was genuinely very bitter. But that just shows how hardy these horses are. I mean, they're just surviving through 100+ temperatures in the summer, minus 30 in the winter, and coping admirably. The fur that the thick coat that they develop in winter certainly gets very tested.
Wow, that is so cool. That is so cool. Hey, Scott, thank you so much for being on the Understand Photography show.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Really nice to get to know you, Peggy.
And you too. Thank you for watching the Understand Photography Show. Thanks to Scott Wilson. That was a great interview, so full of great information. And don't forget to go to the show notes at understandphotography.com because, oh, wait till you see his pictures. Scott is an amazing photographer. I'm Peggy Farron. Thanks for watching the Understand Photography Show. We'll see you next Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time.